At 58, I hired a private investigator for one reason only: peace of mind. I wasn't chasing betrayal. I wasn't hunting for proof. I didn't suspect an affair or a crime or some dramatic double life that belonged in headlines. I simply wanted to be sure that the man I had been married to for decades was still living the same life I was. Days later, Owen Blake sat across from me in a quiet office and slid a thin file forward. Inside were documents I had never seen. He didn't rush. He didn't explain right away. He gave me time to open it myself, to absorb the weight of paper that didn't belong in my world but somehow had always existed beside it. Finally, he looked at me and said quietly, "Ma'am, this changes everything. If you're drawn to stories where the truth doesn't arrive loudly, where patience and preparation matter more than confrontation, take a moment to subscribe and tell me where you are watching from in the comments." This story doesn't move fast, but it moves deliberately. What Owen didn't know yet was that, by the time he spoke those words, I was already prepared to listen. Because the truth is, Gregory Whitfield hadn't shocked me in months. He had unsettled me. That's a different thing. Gregory hadn't become cruel or distant in obvious ways. He was still charming, still attentive in public, still remembered anniversaries and birthdays and the small rituals that make a marriage look intact from the outside. But he had started living adjacent to me. Phone calls taken just out of earshot. Financial conversations smoothed over with confidence instead of clarity. Questions answered politely but briefly, like I was interrupting something more important. After enough years with someone, you stop listening to what they say and start listening to how they move through space. Gregory moved carefully, deliberately, like someone managing multiple versions of himself. Our daughter Natalie noticed it too. She didn't accuse, she didn't dramatize. She simply watched him the way I did, her eyes lingering a second too long when he checked his phone at dinner, or when he excused himself to take a quick call that never felt quick. One evening, after Gregory went to bed early, Natalie asked me if everything was okay between us. I told her yes, not because it was true, but because I needed time to make it true. I didn't confront Gregory. Confrontation gives people the opportunity to rewrite history while you're still questioning your instincts. I had learned, over a lifetime of careful observation, that clarity comes from documentation, not explanations. That was when I contacted Owen Blake. I didn't choose him out of urgency. I chose him out of alignment. He didn't promise answers. He promised accuracy. When we met, he didn't ask me how I felt about my husband. He asked me what I had noticed. That question alone told me I'd made the right decision. I told him everything that hadn't quite added up. The softened financial transparency, the accounts I no longer recognized. The way Gregory spoke about money as if it were something abstract, handled, resolved, distant. Owen listened without interrupting. Then he nodded once and said something that stayed with me. "People don't hide events first," he said. "They hide systems." The early days of his work were uneventful. Gregory followed his routines, went to work, came home, paid bills, played his role perfectly. If I had been looking for scandal, I would have felt foolish. But I wasn't looking for scandal. I was looking for structure, and structures leave traces. The first discovery was a secondary financial account, carefully maintained, consistently funded. Entirely separate from anything I had ever signed or discussed. Not illegal, not sloppy, just deliberately excluded from our shared life. I remember staring at the numbers without emotion. This wasn't panic-inducing information. It was clarifying. Then came property records. A modest commercial property transferred through a holding company I'd never heard of. Gregory's signature was there, clear, confident, unquestionable. The date reached back years. Long enough that the omission couldn't be explained away as oversight. I didn't cry. I didn't feel betrayed in the cinematic sense. What I felt was something steadier. Recognition. This hadn't happened to me, it had been built around me. That night I lay beside Gregory and listened to his breathing. Calm, even, untroubled. I wondered how long he had trusted the version of reality he'd curated. How long he believed no one would ever slow down enough to examine the details. The next morning I made coffee like always, kissed his cheek, asked about his day. He smiled easily, unaware that the ground beneath him had already shifted. That was when I called Marissa Keene. Marissa didn't ask me why I was calling. She asked what I wanted to protect. My future, my financial independence, my daughter's stability. I told her I wasn't interested in confrontation. I wanted preparation. I wanted every step to be quiet, lawful, and irreversible. She nodded. "That's the strongest position you can take," she said. From that moment on, every move I made was intentional. Documents copied, accounts reviewed, timelines established. Natalie protected from information she didn't need yet. Gregory continued living comfortably inside the marriage he believed he controlled. What he didn't know was that I was no longer searching for reassurance. I was building certainty. And the file Owen slid across the table was only the beginning. The most dangerous part of discovering the truth is the moment you realize how long it's been true. After Owen slid the file across the table, I didn't rush home. I didn't call anyone. I sat in my car for nearly an hour, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I needed to understand what I was feeling before it hardened into something less useful. Shock fades, anger flares. But clarity lasts. I drove home the same way I always did, stopping at the same light, turning onto the same quiet street where Gregory's car was already parked in the driveway. From the outside, nothing had changed. That illusion had protected him for years. Inside, he greeted me warmly, asked about my day, told me about a meeting that ran long. I listened carefully, not to the words but to the ease with which they were delivered. There was no strain in his voice, no fear of discovery. That told me something important. Whatever Gregory was hiding, he believed it was permanent. If you're still here, you already understand this story isn't about catching someone, it's about outlasting them. Stay with me. I began paying closer attention, not in obvious ways, but in the spaces he assumed were unobserved. The rhythm of his phone calls, the way his tone shifted when he spoke to certain people, the calm confidence with which he dismissed financial questions. When I mentioned the property taxes had increased, he didn't ask which property. That detail landed heavily. People who live one life ask clarifying questions. People managing two lives already know the answers. I updated Owen weekly, never emotionally, always factually. Dates, times, account references, names that appeared more than once. He never reacted, never speculated. He simply collected. Then he found something that reframed everything. There was a pattern of payments leaving the secondary account, regular, modest, and consistent, not extravagant, not impulsive. The kind of payments someone makes when they're maintaining a household, not indulging in secrecy. This wasn't a fling, it was infrastructure. When Owen said that, I felt something settle into place. It explained the discipline, the patience, the long-term thinking. Gregory hadn't been reckless, he had been committed to something else. I asked Owen not to investigate people yet. I wanted the architecture mapped before faces entered the picture. Once you attach emotions to information, objectivity weakens. Instead, we traced timelines. The property transfer coincided with a period I remembered clearly, when Gregory had suggested we simplify our finances. When he'd taken over certain responsibilities, framing it as relief for me, I had agreed, not out of disinterest but out of trust. Trust, I realized, is often leveraged politely. At home, I remained unchanged. I laughed when appropriate. I asked Natalie about her work, her plans, her life. I made sure she never felt tension in the house. Whatever Gregory had done, I refused to let it touch her before I understood its full shape. Natalie sensed my restraint. One evening, she told me I seemed focused. Not upset, not distracted. Focused. She was right. Focus is what replaces confusion when you stop asking why and start asking how. Marissa Keene guided me through that transition with precision. She didn't advise emotional distance, she advised structural advantage. We reviewed marital assets, historical filings, beneficiary designations that hadn't been updated in years. People who plan secret lives, she said, often neglect the legal consequences. They assume discretion equals safety. That assumption would become Gregory's most expensive mistake. We began quietly securing documents, duplicating records, establishing timelines that couldn't be disputed. Every move was lawful, every step reversible until it wasn't. Then Owen called me one afternoon and asked if I was ready to know who else lived in Gregory's world. I didn't answer immediately, because names change things. Names introduce grief, anger, the temptation to confront. I needed to be certain I could receive the information without losing the discipline that had carried me this far. Finally, I told him yes. He didn't start with a person. He started with evidence. school records, utility bills, medical insurance usage, all tied back quietly to Gregory's secondary financial life. There was another household, not recent, not accidental, years old. I remember staring at the page and thinking not about betrayal, but about endurance. The effort required to maintain two lives without collapse. That level of maintenance doesn't happen without intention. That night, Gregory poured himself a drink and asked if I wanted one. I declined. Watched the way he moved through the kitchen, familiar and unguarded. I wondered how often he had stood in another kitchen, performing the same gestures, telling himself it was necessary. I slept deeply that night, deeper than I had in months. Because once the truth is named, it stops haunting you. The next morning, I called Natalie and asked her to have lunch with me later that week. Not to tell her anything, but to remind myself what I was protecting. This wasn't about exposure. It wasn't about humiliation. It was about ensuring that when Gregory's carefully managed world finally collapsed, it wouldn't fall on me or my daughter. By the time Owen confirmed the relationship, long-term, domestic, deliberate, I had already accepted the outcome. There would be no dramatic confrontation, no accusations flung across a kitchen table, no demands for explanations that could be reshaped into excuses. What Gregory had built took years. What I was building would only need one moment. And when that moment arrived, it would be quiet, documented, final. Because the most devastating consequences aren't emotional. They're structural. And Gregory was about to learn that the life he thought he controlled had been standing on foundations he never bothered to check. There is a moment, after the truth fully reveals itself, when you stop feeling like a participant and start feeling like an architect. By the time Owen confirmed the existence of Gregory's second household, I no longer experienced the sharp edges of betrayal. Those had dulled into something more useful, precision. I asked Owen to slow down, not because I was afraid of what else we might find, but because speed invites mistakes. Gregory had taken years to build his second life. I intended to understand it thoroughly before touching anything that might alert him. Owen understood immediately. He always did. He continued documenting quietly: lease agreements, insurance records, patterns of movement that aligned too neatly to be coincidence. Everything pointed to permanence, not secrecy born of impulse. This wasn't a mistake Gregory made. It was a choice he maintained. At home, Gregory remained unaware. He talked about future travel plans, mentioned renovations he wanted to make to the house we shared, spoke about retirement as if it were a joint destination rather than a divided one. I listened carefully. Not to respond, but to remember. People tell you everything when they think you're still on their side. If you're still here, understand this. The most powerful move you can make when you uncover deception is not confrontation. It's silence backed by preparation. Marissa Keene helped me convert information into leverage. We reviewed the timing of asset acquisitions against marital income, cross-referenced signatures, mapped what was legally marital property versus what Gregory assumed he had separated cleanly. Assumptions, I learned, are where careful liars get careless. Several of the properties tied to Gregory's other life had been acquired while we were still filing jointly. That mattered a great deal. Marissa never raised her voice. She didn't dramatize the implications. She simply laid out scenarios, each one calmer and more devastating than the last. Documentation removes debate, she said. Once you remove debate, control shifts. Control had already shifted. Gregory just hadn't noticed yet. I began organizing my own records, not as a reaction but as a declaration of independence I hadn't yet voiced. I separated accounts lawfully, updated beneficiaries, ensured Natalie's future was insulated from whatever legal turbulence might come. Natalie sensed a change in me, not anxiety but resolve. She didn't push. She trusted that when I was ready, I would speak. That trust became my anchor. Owen eventually presented the final piece I needed, a complete timeline. It showed when Gregory's second life began, how it evolved, and how deliberately it had been protected from discovery. There were no overlaps that suggested guilt or confusion, just careful separation. 2 households, 2 narratives, 1 man who believed discretion equaled invisibility. I asked Owen a single question. Does he suspect anything? Owen shook his head. No, he's very comfortable. Comfort is dangerous. It dulls perception. That evening, Gregory mentioned a business trip scheduled for the following month. He spoke casually, confidently. I nodded, already knowing exactly where he would be and with whom. I said nothing. Instead, I scheduled my next meeting with Marissa. We finalized the structure, the timing, the legal triggers that would activate once documentation was submitted. Everything aligned to occur while Gregory believed he was in control of the narrative. There would be no scene, no raised voices, no opportunity for negotiation framed as reconciliation, only consequences delivered cleanly. The night before Gregory left for his trip, he hugged me longer than usual. Told me he appreciated how steady I'd been lately. I almost smiled. Steadiness, after all, had always been my strength. He just hadn't realized how dangerous it could become when paired with evidence. The morning he left, I made coffee and watched his car disappear down the street. Then I sat at the kitchen table and reviewed the file one last time. Every document was in place. Every step had been taken with intention. When Marissa filed the paperwork later that week, it moved exactly as designed. Accounts were frozen where they needed to be. Legal notifications were issued precisely, unemotionally. Gregory's assumptions met the immovable reality of law. He called me that evening. I let it ring, then again. When I finally answered, his voice was controlled but strained. He asked questions that revealed more than he intended. Confusion. Surprise, the first cracks in the performance. I told him we would speak when he returned, not because I owed him an explanation, but because I had nothing left to say that couldn't wait. Natalie came over that night. I told her what she needed to know, no details, no images she couldn't unsee, just the truth framed with stability. She listened quietly, then she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I trust you, she said. That trust confirmed everything. Gregory returned 2 days later to a reality that no longer accommodated his carefully divided life. The documentation spoke for itself. There was nothing to argue with. No angle left to manipulate. He looked smaller somehow, not defeated, exposed. And in that moment I felt no triumph, only relief, because the power had never come from uncovering his secret. It came from refusing to rush, refusing to rage, and refusing to give him the chance to rewrite the ending. The life Gregory thought he controlled was already over. What remained was simply the formal acknowledgement of that fact. And it would happen on my terms. By the time Gregory understood what was happening, the story he had rehearsed for years no longer mattered. He tried to speak first when he returned home, not loudly, not defensively. Carefully, like someone testing whether the rules he once relied on still applied. I let him talk long enough to confirm what I already knew. He believed there was room to negotiate. That assumption told me everything. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I didn't list the ways he had deceived me. I simply told him that my attorney would be handling all communication going forward and that any questions he had should be directed there. The silence that followed was unfamiliar to him. Gregory had always filled space with charm. Without it, he looked unprepared. If you're still listening, understand this. The moment you remove yourself from the emotional exchange, you remove the other person's leverage entirely. Marissa Keene moved efficiently. Filings progressed. Asset disclosures were compelled. The systems Gregory had relied on, opacity, compartmentalization, assumed ignorance, collapsed under legal scrutiny. The second household, once carefully insulated, became visible in ways Gregory had never anticipated. Paper trails don't argue. They simply reveal. Owen remained involved only as necessary. His work was done, but his documentation continued to support the process quietly, decisively. Everything Gregory had treated as private was now simply recorded. At home, the atmosphere shifted. Gregory stopped pretending nothing was wrong. He oscillated between contrition and calculation, unsure which version of himself might still be effective. Neither was. Natalie watched the changes without fear. I made sure of that. She stayed informed enough to feel secure, but never burdened with details that belonged to me alone. Protection isn't secrecy, it's filtration. One evening, Gregory attempted what I suspect he considered honesty. He spoke about loneliness, about pressure, about choices made gradually rather than suddenly. I listened without interruption. When he finished, I thanked him for sharing and reminded him that explanations don't undo structures. That was the end of the conversation. As the legal process unfolded, something unexpected happened. I didn't feel diminished. I felt unburdened. The effort of maintaining belief in a reality that no longer aligned with evidence had been heavier than I realized. Marissa secured provisions that ensured long-term stability for me and for Natalie. Retirement accounts were protected. Properties were accounted for. The future, once blurred by Gregory's hidden decisions, came back into focus. Gregory's second life unraveled quietly, not through exposure or public embarrassment, but through logistics, financial recalibration, legal acknowledgement, the slow dismantling of assumptions he had relied on for years. He never asked how I found out. I think he understood that the answer wouldn't help him. If you've stayed this far, you already know this isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about alignment. About restoring balance through patience and preparation rather than confrontation. The day the final documents were signed, there was no ceremony, no sense of victory, just completion. I went home, made tea, and sat by the window as the evening settled in. The house felt different, not emptier, but clearer. Natalie called to check in. Her voice was steady, so was mine. Gregory moved out shortly after. There were no dramatic goodbyes, just logistics handled cleanly. In the end, the most devastating thing I did was refuse to be destabilized. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand explanations. I didn't beg for honesty that should have existed from the beginning. I documented, I prepared, I protected. And when the time came, I let the truth do what it always does when it's allowed to stand unchallenged. It ended things quietly. Completely, on my terms. The aftermath didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded the way truth usually does, slowly, methodically, and without asking for permission. After Gregory moved out, the house settled into a new rhythm. Not silence, clarity. I noticed it in small ways first. The way mornings felt unhurried. The absence of that low, persistent tension I'd mistaken for normalcy. I hadn't realized how much energy I'd spent maintaining equilibrium for someone who was never fully present. Gregory attempted contact a few more times, practical questions at first, then softer ones. He never pushed. He understood, at least instinctively, that pushing would only accelerate the distance. Marissa Keene handled everything with the same precision she'd shown from the beginning. Final confirmations, long-term safeguards, the kind of legal closure that doesn't just end a marriage but prevents its ghost from reappearing later. When she told me everything was complete, I thanked her and felt something I hadn't expected. Finality, not bitterness, not grief. Finality is quieter than that. It's the absence of anticipation. Owen Blake called shortly after to confirm he'd archived everything securely. No loose ends, no vulnerabilities. He didn't offer congratulations. He didn't need to. His work had never been about drama. It had been about truth surviving intact. Natalie came over for dinner that weekend. We cooked together the way we used to when she was younger. She asked questions not about Gregory but about me, about plans, about what came next. I told her the truth. I wasn't rebuilding, I was reclaiming. She smiled at that, not because it sounded inspiring but because it sounded accurate. That night after she left, I walked through the house and noticed something else. Nothing felt contaminated anymore. Every room belonged to me again. Every object had one story, not two. Gregory's second life had collapsed quietly. I didn't track it. I didn't need to. What mattered was that it no longer intersected with mine or Natalie's future. People sometimes expect revenge to feel triumphant. They expect justice to feel loud. But the most powerful outcome is stability restored. Weeks passed. Then months. I found myself laughing more easily, sleeping deeply, making decisions without mentally accounting for someone else's secrets. The freedom wasn't dramatic, it was structural. One afternoon, I found the original folder Owen had slid across the table. I hadn't opened it in weeks. When I finally did, it felt different. The documents no longer carried weight. They were evidence of something that had already been resolved. I closed the folder and filed it away, not out of fear, but out of respect for what it had given me. Certainty. Gregory never apologized in the way people expect. He offered explanations, context, regret framed carefully enough to preserve his own narrative. I didn't correct him. The need to be understood fades once you understand yourself. If you're still listening, take this with you. Patience is not passivity, silence is not weakness, and preparation is not cruelty. They are tools. At 58, I didn't lose my life. I refused to lose it quietly. I protected my daughter. I preserved my future. And I walked away without chaos, without spectacle, and without doubt. The most devastating truth Gregory faced wasn't exposure, it was irrelevance. Because the moment I stopped reacting to his choices, he stopped having any power over my life at all. And that, more than any confrontation, changed everything. Closure doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, often disguised as routine. Months after everything had been finalized, I realized I no longer checked my phone expecting Gregory's name to appear. That habit had dissolved without effort. What replaced it wasn't relief or satisfaction, but something steadier. Autonomy. The life I was living now required no translation, no mental adjustments, no allowances for another person's secrets. Every decision belonged entirely to me. Marissa Keene called one afternoon to confirm the final administrative details had cleared. Nothing urgent, just confirmation. The kind of call that marks the true end of a process. When we hung up, I sat for a moment longer than necessary, letting the significance settle. This wasn't the end of a marriage anymore. It was the stabilization of a future. Owen Blake's role had long since concluded, but his presence lingered in the form of certainty. I didn't wonder anymore whether I had imagined things or overreacted. The evidence had done its job. It had anchored my instincts to reality. Natalie visited regularly, not out of concern, but out of comfort. She noticed the changes too, the ease, the consistency, the absence of guardedness in the house. One evening, she told me she was proud of how I handled everything. I didn't deflect it, I accepted it. Strength doesn't need to be denied once it's earned. Gregory faded from my life the way he had once faded within it, gradually, predictably. There were no lingering disputes, no emotional ambushes. The systems in place prevented that. Structure protects long after emotions pass. I began making plans without negotiation. Travel, investments, quiet ambitions I had postponed without realizing I'd done so. None of it felt like reinvention. It felt like continuation without interference. Occasionally, I thought about the woman I'd been before I hired Owen. Not naive, not blind, just trusting. I don't regret that version of myself. Trust isn't a flaw, it only becomes dangerous when it's exploited without consequence. One morning, while organizing paperwork, I found an old anniversary card Gregory had written years earlier. It spoke about partnership, about honesty, about growing old together. I read it once. Then I recycled it, not out of anger, but because it no longer belonged in the life I was building. If you're still here, understand this. Justice doesn't always look like vindication. Sometimes it looks like stability regained and chaos prevented. At 58, I didn't start over, I took control. I didn't confront, I documented, I didn't plead, I prepared. And when the truth emerged, I let it stand on its own. Gregory lost the life he thought he was managing. Natalie kept the future she deserved, and I moved forward without carrying anything that wasn't mine. That's what changed everything. Not the discovery, the discipline. Time has a way of confirming decisions long after emotions stop trying to argue with them. A year after everything unraveled, I noticed something unexpected. The story no longer followed me. It didn't sit in conversations. It didn't surface in quiet moments. It had settled into the past without resistance. That's how I knew I'd handled it correctly. Natalie had grown more confident in that year too. Not because of what happened, but because she'd watched stability survive deception. She'd seen that quiet strength doesn't collapse under pressure, it reorganizes. One afternoon, she asked me a question that surprised me. How did you know when to stop waiting? I thought about it carefully before answering. I didn't stop waiting, I told her. I stopped doubting. That distinction mattered. Gregory remained distant but not resentful. Distance was his default when control slipped away. There were no more attempts to reframe the past, no revisionist explanations. The legal clarity had closed that door permanently. Marissa Keene checked in occasionally, not as an attorney, but as someone who understood the architecture of endings. She told me that most people rush the final step and regret it later. You didn't, she said once. That's rare. What she didn't say, but what I understood was that patience is the difference between survival and dominance. Owen Blake had taught me something similar in his own way. He'd once said that truth doesn't need momentum. It only needs room. I'd given it room. Life continued not dramatically but deliberately. Mornings filled with purpose instead of monitoring. Evenings free of calculation. The absence of vigilance became its own reward. Occasionally, people asked how I'd managed everything so calmly. I never gave them the full story, not because it was secret, but because it didn't belong to anyone else. The version that mattered was already complete. I learned that strength isn't about endurance alone, it's about direction. Endurance without direction just prolongs suffering. At 58, I chose direction, the quiet kind. The kind that doesn't announce itself but leaves no doubt once it's finished. Gregory's deception had been elaborate, but it had relied on one fragile assumption that I would never slow down enough to see it clearly. He was wrong. Natalie and I talked about the future more now, not out of necessity but curiosity. Plans made without contingency clauses. Trust rebuilt not in others but in ourselves. If you're still listening, remember this. The most powerful transformations don't come from confrontation. They come from clarity, from preparation, from knowing when the truth has done enough and allowing it to close the door behind you. I didn't win, I concluded. And that made all the difference. Years after I first sat across from Owen Blake and watched him slide that file toward me, I can say this with certainty. The moment that changed my life wasn't the discovery. It was the decision that followed it. The decision not to rush, not to confront, not to beg for honesty from someone who had already chosen secrecy. Gregory Whitfield is no longer part of my daily life, not in anger, not in grief. Simply in fact, his choices created a separation long before the legal one ever existed. All I did was recognize it and act accordingly. Natalie built her own life on stable ground. That mattered more to me than any explanation Gregory ever offered. Children don't need to see chaos to understand truth. They need to see consistency survive it. Marissa Keene once told me that most people believe justice is loud because they've never experienced the quiet kind. The kind that arrives through preparation and ends things cleanly. She was right. Owen's work sits archived now, untouched, not because it's forgotten, but because it did its job. Evidence doesn't demand attention once it's fulfilled its purpose. I live differently now, not cautiously, intentionally. I trust myself more than I ever did before, not because I became harder, but because I became clearer. There is a difference. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that patience isn't passive. It's strategic. Silence isn't weakness, it's leverage, and dignity once claimed cannot be taken back. At 58, I didn't lose a marriage, I gained certainty. I didn't walk away loudly, I walked away prepared. And the life I refused to lose quietly became the one I now live fully, unburdened, intact, and entirely my own. If this story resonated with you, if you believe strength doesn't need to shout, consider subscribing. Stories like this aren't about spectacle, they're about clarity, control, and quiet justice. Thank you for staying until the end.